to the SDS book launch event of Border Nation, A Story of Migration by Leah Cowan. Very excited to have Leah and Maya with us. I'm personally very, very psyched to be a part of it and looking forward to having this discussion with everyone. So I'm Tom Kemp. I'm an organizer with SOAS Detainee Support, which is a grassroots abolitionist group that works in solidarity with people held in immigration detention centres in the UK. I also organise with a group called Abolitionist Futures, and I'm a writer and researcher on social movement politics of movements that resist imprisonment and border control at Nottingham Law School. We have Leah Cowan, who is a former coordinator of SOAS Detainee Support back in 2013 and 2014, former politics editor at Galdem, currently an advisor at Project 17, and obviously Leah is the author of an excellent new book called Border Nation, A Story of Migration that we are here to discuss. How are you doing, Leah?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having us.
Good to see you. And of course, we also have Maya Goodfellow, who is a writer and academic specialising in relationships between race, bordering and capitalism at the University of Sheffield. Maya is the author of a book, Hostile Environment, How Immigrants Became Scapegoats, published last year by Verso. How are you doing, Maya?
Good, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about Leah's excellent book, which I'm sure I'll say a bit more about later. But yeah, thanks for having me.
Good stuff. So today we're going to have a 45-minute conversation between the three of us before opening up to a good amount of discussion prompted by questions from everyone here. If you could use the chat function to put your questions in, and we'll use them to prompt more discussion after that 45 minutes. So I think we should get started. So for a number of years now, there's been a kind of growing, vibrant, radical movement against border enforcement in the UK. And when Leah and I were working together back in 2013, 14, I think things felt quite different. I think it was during the New Labour period and its aftermath, the institutional and mainstream left had seemingly kind of abandoned the fight against state racism and kind of become its architects, right? They're building the infrastructures of state violence. You had fast-track detention systems, the building of Harmondsworth, Yarswood, no recourse to public funds, pursuing aggressive campaigns of criminalisation, doubling of the prison population. That obviously would be extended by the present kind of conservative regime into the hostile environment. For grassroots and radical NGOs fighting detention and borders back when we started, I think it felt like we were pretty isolated or doing pretty small scale work. But I think slowly we have seen how anti-border politics has built connections across movements, whether it's with feminist anti-violence campaigns at sites like Yarswood, movements of Black liberation, anti-colonial struggles, anti-police and state violence movements, and those that kind of oppose environmental destruction caused by capitalism and kind of rampant wealth inequality. We're learning to build more connected movements. And it's been so wonderful to see that in the last year, there's so much recent scholarship that helps us and guides those movements, whether it's Bordering Britain by Nadine El-Anani, Deporting Black Britons by Luke de Noronha, Empire's Endgame, Hostile Environment, How Immigrants Became Scapegoats by Maya. And now we have Leah's book as well. And I feel like for those radically questioning and opposing Britain's border structures, there are so many more places to start than when we were starting out. And so my first, sorry to kind of go on about that kind of background for me, that's kind of the context of this discussion, I guess. But thinking back to when we started organising in SDS in 2013 and how the movement has developed since then, what were your motivations for writing Border Nation?
Thanks, Tom. Well, yeah, as you say, I kind of started organising with SDS at the advent of the kind of hostile environment as we know it now, which I'm sure Maya will speak to more later. And this was also at the kind of height of detained fast track, which is the process you mentioned, where kind of people seeking asylum were basically having their cases rushed through with these accelerated appeals processes while someone's locked up in detention. And these cases have had a 99% refusal rate, which is much higher for claims that were kind of not being channeled into the detained fast track process. And at the outset of DFT, there was this kind of suitability list of countries, which included the 10 Central and Eastern European countries which joined the EU in 2004, as well as countries that are former British colonies, such as Jamaica, India, and Ghana. And the idea around this was that, you know, the Home Office thought that claims from these countries were likely to be unfounded in their phrasing and should be kind of rushed through and rejected as quickly as possible. After kind of years of campaigning and resistance from people inside and outside and a legal challenge, this process was kind of suspended and ruled systematically unfair. But I think the very kind of existence of detained fast track really kind of revealed the government's hand in demonstrating how border enforcement is targeted, people are racially profiled and blocked from entry or staying here very much as an extension of Britain's kind of colonial exploits, as well as the continuation of racial capitalism. Of course, ending detained fast track just meant the government had to shapeshift in a new direction. So in terms of thinking about the distance travel between, you know, 2013, 14 and now, in the past decade, we've seen the government remaining doggedly committed to detaining people indefinitely. We've seen the ramping up of no recourse to public funds conditions being applied to people's leave, which is an issue that I work on now at Project 17. And we've seen how immigration detention dovetails with the expansion of the private prison estate and the deportation of people who've served a prison sentence. So I think these kind of horrific mechanisms of the border and learning more about them are some of the reasons why I wrote the book. I wrote it as a radical introduction to Britain's borders and the violence that they enact across society. And I use radical in the true sense of really scrutinizing the fundamental nature of what borders are and how they came about. So looking at Britain's colonial history, the key role that Britain has played in colonizing and invading in different ways, you know, 90% of the world, and thinking about how that links to the oppressive border regime that we now live in.
Amazing. Yeah, great. So I wanted to bring it back also to how your activism has shaped your thinking. I'm thinking of like Dean Spade's recent book on mutual aid, talks about how mutual aid spaces, like on the ground solidarity, are always places or should be places where we're learning. And I wondered, and how theory making happens and how we understand the systems we're opposing. And I wondered how much your activism with SDS and other groups had shaped your thinking in the book, and in what ways?
Yeah, I mean, my organising with SDS in particular is crucial to the way that I think about and understand borders. I think one of the most important things I've learned through organising to end detention and deportation and the border is that resistance has always happened and it will keep happening, that it's a kind of continuous process and that we are on this continuous forward movement towards a different future. And this is something that's really well depicted in the book by Natasha King called No Borders. This idea that border abolition is a process that many people are already engaged in, whether it's through border crossing without the permission of a state, or living and working undocumented, or building lives in migrant communities and creating art and literature and films and music that cross borders. That resistance is continuous and happening in so many different ways. I think a kind of portion of that change and that resistance is about, you know, policy change, lobbying, changing laws, etc. But what I learned through SDS is that it absolutely has to happen, or is happening, through kind of radical disruptions of the status quo by people who are experiencing the sharpest end of the border regime. And it's about finding gaps in the border that are both literal and figurative. So I think organising with SDS made it very plain that no borders, in the very kind of straightforward terms, is not this kind of wild fantasy pie in the sky idea. From an abolitionist frame, it's about kind of working in solidarity with each other and creating communities of care and compassion, and learning that the apparatus of the state just very kind of practically isn't part of that vision, that the border is an aggressor and an antagonist, and that we necessarily kind of must dismantle it together.
I think that kind of work of creating communities of care is really at the center of many of these kind of grassroots radical movements. And I guess the majority of SDS's work is providing kind of or like being part of practical and emotional support in solidarity with individuals inside different forms of detention. And it's often kind of firefighting work. It's kind of and as you know, I'm kind of always interested in how kind of radical ideas such as kind of border abolition are connected with everyday forms of practice that don't always directly involve bringing about abolition or go towards the goal of abolishing detention. And I wondered what you thought about the connections between kind of solidarity or grassroots solidarity politics on the one hand and border abolition more widely. Like how much is working in solidarity with people bearing the brunt of punitive border policies a part of abolition? Are they always aligned? And are there any kind of tensions or lessons that can be learned in relation to solidarity and abolition?
Yeah, I mean, I think that solidarity and abolition are kind of inextricably linked. And there's a really good article on a website called abolitioniststudy.wordpress.com. I can link to it in the chat. By a writer called Stevie, who's a Black queer abolitionist organizer and a prisoner in the state of Pennsylvania. And they talk about an example where organizers were kind of setting up a fund for a Black trans woman for when she was released from prison, for kind of setting herself up and having money to cover her basic expenses. And the writer talks about the idea that solidarity is abolition in action. So it's not enough to say, you know, yes, I'm on your side, or I'm going to take action alongside you, or to say, you know, yes, I want a world without, in this example, prisons. I think both of these ways of thinking and doing have to happen at the same time. I think abolitionist praxis is acting in solidarity. It's about those steps towards building and growing our communities. And I think when you talk about firefighting work, you know, acts of solidarity take all forms of shapes and sizes in my experience. And in the struggle towards abolition, there are kind of daily abolitionist acts. I think there's sometimes this idea that activism looks a certain way, and it can be quite a kind of ableist conception that maybe in some imaginations involves like physically putting your body on the line in a public space in a certain way. But abolitionist work is, you know, like people do at SDS, making that journey to Harmondsworth from Paddington, sitting with someone and talking on a level about, you know, what they want and need, and also what you expect from each other as to kind of people working together. And I think those daily acts of abolition is a kind of really great frame for thinking about it. Crucially, it shows that we all have roles to play, and there are access points in the struggle to abolish prisons and detention centres and deportation, and kind of build this better world in a very daily way, as you describe.
Thank you. I think I'm going to bring in Maya now into the conversation. I was just thinking, in the last year or so, or maybe even before that, there's been quite a lot of reduction in the use of immigration detention, or at least the numbers were going down, and then they really plummeted around the start of the pandemic. And a lot of people who were involved in detention work were quite celebratory about this move. And I wanted to know on your understanding, or both your understandings of the current like changing forms of border enforcement and control. Like, is this a win for detention? And is this a win for the border abolition movement going forward? On your understanding, Maya?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And I think Leah's analysis, both now and in the book, are a really important way to sort of center the way we understand immigration and bordering, because I think in a lot of our contemporary political debate, at least sort of in the political mainstream, there is a lot of focus on the figure of the migrant, which we know is really racialized, gendered, the class politics that are sort of inherent in that. And what I found, I found your book, helpful on a range of different levels, but one is really centering the border and centering the processes of bordering, understanding what those processes of bordering are doing, and understanding how they're being resisted and how we must continue to resist them. I think is, that kind of work that's been done during the pandemic. This kind of text is a really, really important one, I think, to accompany that kind of work, so people can understand what has been done before and what can be done going forward. So to say that, anyone who's here listening, if you haven't got yourself a copy, I would really encourage you to, because I found it a really, like, whilst understanding the process of bordering is sort of oblique, it's not joyous in lots of ways. I did actually find a lot of joy and inspiration from the book because of those acts of resistance and these acts of solidarity exactly that you're talking about. And I think, I imagine Leah will have probably better analysis than me of exactly what's happened in relation to detention. But the way that I've sort of understood that is that, on the one hand, it does show us the different kinds of futures and the different kinds of possibilities that are available, that are realizable, and actually shrinking the demands is not something that is, I just don't think it's particularly useful. We might want to talk about strategic demands at particular moments, but having a really more expansive horizon is really, really important to really setting the agenda for what is possible and what can be changed. And so I think that resistance and that demand for people to be released from detention is a really important one, and seeing that happen is a tool in a way that can be used to explain to people, because often you get caught up in these debates about the specifics of the policies or how the steps you take towards real systemic change. And I do think that you don't have to engage with those debates, but I think it can be useful at times to do that. And so I think it is a really important and useful example. But there's always a but. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that many people were still kept in detention, and this was tied up with a narrative around criminality that I think that parts of the left shy away from in a really unhelpful way. When we talk about foreign national offenders, that must be resisted, as a lot of people are doing that resistance. But I think in the contemporary political debate, that doesn't really happen in a significant way that it needs to. And I should have flipped it around and started with the more negative and then ended with the positive. But I would say, given where the state is at, given where the government that we have is at, unfortunately, we've just seen a doubling down on this kind of the necessity, their arguments around the necessity for detention. And so for me, it provides hope that change is possible, but really a reminder, I suppose, of the scale of what you're sort of up against, which is in a way actually useful, because when we're talking about state power, we aren't only talking about terrible conservative governments, we're also thinking about what the opposition's doing, which is nothing. We're thinking about the histories that you sort of nodded to, thinking about New Labour, thinking about the history of the Labour Party more generally. And for me, that's sort of, whilst it seems kind of bleak, it's inspiring to think about the different forms of political action that need to be taken, that are being taken outside of this sort of narrow realm of parliamentary politics. So the resistance and the change is actually coming from outside of those. The Corbyn moment sort of meant that a lot of political energy was focused on parliamentary politics. And I think this is just a reminder that actually that's not necessarily where change is going to happen.
Yeah, I would largely kind of echo what Maya said, but I think it's important to tentatively celebrate things that mean material improvements to people's everyday lives. and hundreds of people being released from detention is kind of a positive thing on the face of it. I think as movements, we aren't necessarily good at celebrating wins and sharing learning from those moments. From one kind of perspective, I think the pandemic has revealed that so many things that were deemed just kind of utterly impossible and untouchable ideas under neoliberalism, such as kind of long-term working from home arrangements, are actually quite doable, even within the kind of framework of the status quo. So I'm not surprised that people are celebrating the reduction, because it does signal quite concretely, both kind of from and to government, that people do not need to be detained. People being released, I think, went quite under the radar, which is likely kind of an intentional move from government. But maybe they've seen that, you know, it's possible for them to climb down from quite rigid positions without seemingly much kind of political backlash. I'm not, you know, saying that the government have remotely developed any kind of sense of compassion or humanity. As Maya said, you know, certain groups, particularly criminalized people, are still in detention. More just in a very clinical sense, that they can see that one action doesn't have the fallout that they might have expected. Of course, you know, the government already knew that detention wasn't needed. There's no kind of logical case for detention. It's very much this propaganda exercise, so the government can, you know, point to it and say that it's being tough on immigration and continue to kind of pour money into the pockets of the private companies that manage them. But, you know, we know that the government has no ideological interest in ending detention or relaxing the border regime. So we have to kind of establish how it plans to kind of shapeshift around conceding ground in this area and prepare to push back on it. I mean, in the past couple of weeks, we've seen the government's new plans for people seeking asylum, which are, of course, absolutely abhorrent, but perhaps a much clearer representation of the intended direction of travel when it comes to bordering and immigration laws. As many people watching and listening will know, Priti Patel is proposing this two-tier system, which will divide up people into two categories, depending on whether they arrive in the country through a formal or informal route, to use their language. And people who are placed in the kind of latter category will have to present evidence about why they can't return to a country they've left every 2.5 years, which will kind of bring, you know, a lot of financial and emotional cost to that person. And we're going to see lots more people being subjected to the no recourse to public funds condition, which places people on this high, dangerous precipice with the welfare safety net kind of completely removed. And as we've seen in the pandemic, a lot of people being pushed, you know, right to the edge and experiencing, you know, the border through the NRPF conditions. So I think it seems clear that the border continues to be fortified at every opportunity, but that doesn't mean we should dismiss the kind of material and symbolic value actually of hundreds of people being released. We can look at the conditions that led to that moment and learn from them and replicate them and continue to try and expand those spaces for resistance and action, so they're not you know, siloed into certain groups of people. Try and expand the groups that can access that release.
Yeah, I think that point, sorry, I think that's a really, really important point about recognizing actually the material change that for particular groups or for particular people, and the importance of not losing sight of that, because despite having just said there are different forms of political action that can change things, it is also true that lobbying or demanding or pressuring for some kind of policy change in particular ways isn't necessarily inconsequential to the discussions around abolition and how you achieve that and the steps towards that. And I think one sort of good example of the potential positives and negatives of that is thinking about the immigration health surcharge, which was sort of the big campaign around that was dropped, despite the sort of ongoing issues with the way that the government are behaving, but that was dropped for people who work in the health and care system. So that's great. Like that is an important thing that's happened for a lot of people, not least people who are on really low salaries, not having to pay that if the government sort of delivers in the way that it says that it would. But then it's still, you know, everyone else is still having to pay that. So I think that it's about building on building on some of those narratives and building on some of those like victories, and exactly as Leah says, not losing sight of the fact that yes, while there are major limitations that we should look at and focus on, it doesn't mean that it like renders this unimportant for people's lives. And I think that that's often what's lost in some of the, like, I think I'm sometimes guilty of that too, is like not necessarily recognizing how important the wins are for people. And that I think I think that's just a really important point to make.
Right, I think that's right too. I think the characterization or the recognition of the border's shape-shifting capabilities is such an important aspect, whether you're thinking about, the Napier and the encampment idea that's kind of coming up after the changing to asylum system, increasing kind of charter flights in relation to European migrants in the last 6 months or so. I think, but obviously I can see learning from wins is really an important aspect as well. So I guess I kind of wanted to ask a few questions around kind of how border politics works or within the wider kind of political kind of system and ideas that are quite in the mainstream. Leah starts the book with the sentence, "Borders are indisputably sites of violence," and yet it struck me that at least that the mainstream continually denies this violence, right? The establishment kind of denies the existence of racism in the past, in the present, and more than that, it denies that the state exists it denies that the state exists to kind of uphold the property and power of the white and kind of wealthy. Even last week, we saw in the report, that drew kind of selectively on statistics to deny there was a problem with racial inequality, tried to kind of whitewash the Caribbean kind of experience of slavery, it seemed. And yet today's border system is like something that primarily targets working class migrants of color. It's not seen in the mainstream as a site of discrimination and violence. And I wondered like how we can work in conditions where the mainstream doesn't see or like continually denies this violence, basically. Have you got any ideas on that?
Do you want to go, Maya, or shall I go?
Go ahead.
I think, as you say, in kind of simple terms, the denial of the inherent violence of the border comes about in part because of Britain's failure to reckon with its long history that extends far beyond its shores. And this is, of course, the history of colonization and the transatlantic slave trade, and the development of racial capitalism through both of those, and the long-term impact of those violent campaigns of brutalization and dehumanization. I think with a better understanding of that, it leads us to the conclusion that borders exist to maintain the kind of racist and classist status quo. There's so many examples of this throughout history. As you were saying, Tom, the idea of the state existing to uphold the power of the white and wealthy, the kind of compensation that was paid not to the people that were enslaved by Britain, but to the people that had enslaved them, being the biggest kind of public funds payout of all time until the kind of 2008 bailout of the bankers. I think knowing that, we can kind of start to see how borders shut out people from the global south, and as you said, increasingly marginalize and working class people from the EU and prevent them from accessing the wealth and opportunities hoarded in the country after these centuries of profiteering on the global stage. I think your question was, how can we build movements in this context? And I mean, I guess we are building movements. I suppose, how can we build movements more effectively? I think that kind of education piece has to happen. I know a lot of people are kind of campaigning around the curriculum and trying to kind of improve and expand public knowledge of the history of this country. I think that is fundamental for giving us that grounding, which will then kind of provide the fertile soil for our organizing. But what do you think, Maya?
I think it's a good question, and I think there's a number of things, like a number of ways to, I suppose, sort of think about this. And exactly as Leah says, thinking about the education angle, I think is an important one. And the reason why is, I mean, there's a number of reasons why, but I think one sort of good example that I came across last year is the BBC had produced this sort of guide to Britain's history of immigration, as well as like recent history and thinking about the immigration debate more broadly. And you know, there's a number of things you could say about it, but one is that when they gave a very brief history of post-war migration, is sort of what they called it. They had like one section that was titled something like Asian immigrants coming to Britain in the 1950s, and it's really telling that there was no engagement with the fact that people were citizens and subjects. They were coming not as immigrants, but they had the legal right to move, and without wanting to sort of like reify that and what that meant, and sort of reproduce the really unhelpful binary between the citizen and the non-citizen that I think was sort of apparent in some of the Windrush debate or response to Windrush. One of the things that Gominda Bambra, who I interviewed for the book, said to me, which I think was really important, is that those policies that were introduced in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, they were called immigration policies or nationality policies, but they weren't. They were policies of racialization. They were producing racialized others, right? And so that very understanding of the term immigrant and the sort of history, the recent history of that, is rooted in this racial demarcation of who is sort of the problem and who is not. And I guess like thinking about the class element of that, and thinking about the class history of that, if you go and look at Bridget Anderson's work, she really nicely, depressingly sort of looks at this history of movement even within England, of the way that different people's movement has been curbed depending on their class position. And I mean, there's a really long history of that. And so we really see this sort of dovetailing of class, gender, and race in a lot of those immigration acts. But for thinking about now, I suppose one of the major problems is even how the mainstream understands racism. And so much of it, right, is boiled down to representation, is boiled down to a really sort of basic, poor understanding of racism that essentially strips away the material, strips away the class element. And so I don't know if this is something we can like go around. I mean, I think it is actually. There's a really good quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, her definition of racism, which is the state sanctioned or extra legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. If that isn't applicable to what has happened during this pandemic, then I have no idea when it is, right? And so I think when else people will understand this, rather. And so I think thinking about what's happened during the pandemic, it's not only the Black and minority ethnic people have been worse affected, it's also that the government has literally actively made migrant populations more vulnerable by refusing to suspend parts of their immigration policy, by actively bordering, right? On the government website in the first lockdown, they literally had guidelines saying you can't enforce the hostile environment in the way that you would if you're a landlord, because you can't meet in person, but you can do it over Zoom. Right. And so like there was an adjustment, but it was an adjustment in order to continue those bordering policies. And so I guess it is really part of this is about resisting these sort of liberal understandings of racism and really making it clear that it's the Sivanandan quote, right? You have the racism that discriminates, and then you have the racism that kills. And this is like, we're talking about all of this. And I think like bringing these, I mean, as a lot of people are doing, bringing these debates together is sort of an important one for thinking about how you resist that narrative, I suppose.
Great. And I guess another aspect of like I think a lot of today's political rhetoric is often produced through this idea of a politics of scarcity, right? The idea that that there's a finite amount of resource that to be shared, such that any kind of anti-racist demands are constantly translated into the mainstream as against the interests of a supposed white majority, right? So it's always presented as this zero-sum game, that a win for migrants or a win is a loss for citizens in general. And I wonder how, like, again, I guess a prompt is like, how can we think about organizing in those conditions, in those kind of rhetorical conditions? Yeah, Leah?
Yeah, I think fear and kind of white fragility are very important details when it comes to talking about the lubricants to racist or xenophobic opinions or behaviors. And fear is a very kind of primal, intimate instinct. I think it's very simple and straightforward, and it can kind of quickly override logic. And you know, we know that politicians for centuries actually have capitalized on that fear and used it to drive, or to try and drive, wedges in society, blaming scarcity of resources on one group or social discord on another, rather than taking stock of the impact of their own policies and the way that, for example, a lack of social housing or jobs or kind of chronic underfunding of the healthcare system is actually what is letting people down and making lives untenable, not the existence of migrant communities in the UK. I think for me, the other side of that kind of fear of the scarcity of resources is entitlement. I think we need to think about these two feelings in tandem. Why does the fear that someone else being in the country, meaning that there are going to be less jobs for you, for example, lead us straight to a place of thinking, well, that person has to go. For that logic to work, we must think that we're entitled to a job and a livelihood, but that person isn't. Whereas actually, as humans, of course, we're all entitled to live safe and comfortable lives. So why can't we use that shared fear, perhaps, to think, how can we all have the jobs that we need? How can we protect each other's jobs? Maybe we should join a union and, you know, fight side by side for a decent wage and secure contracts together. We know that there's enough money to go around. Britain is a very wealthy country. So the next piece, once we recognize that fear, is to understand that a fear of resources is very much a shared fear, and we're much stronger at tackling those things if we join together. And obviously there's countless examples throughout history of kind of trade union movements being spearheaded by migrant communities, and the working class being the most kind of diverse class in society. You know, knowing that if we join together, rather than let our communities, or not that we let our communities, but experiencing our communities being divided by that kind of rhetoric of a scarcity of resources, I think is really important.
Yeah, and I think what Leah's book does really well, like exactly in relation to this, as well as making the points that you just made, I think it really sort of situates this in the global context, right? And thinking about Britain's history, where is that wealth come from? How has Britain been built? And what does that sort of tell us about movement and about bordering? And I think that that's a really important, that history, and also its contemporary, the way it operates in the contemporary moment, is a really, really important part of that puzzle of, like, the thing that I often want to ask people is, like, why do you think people are moving? Like, there are many different reasons, and we don't want to sort of reduce this down to like a flat narrative that I guess reproduces the figure of these figures of the migrants that we've often see in the political debate. But I do think it's an important question to ask, because something that Asad Rehman, who's at War and Want, often says is, we're not only fighting for the right for people to move, we're also fighting for the right for people to stay, right? And so I think that global context, and thinking about the material nature of that Leah's book really engages with that really, really well, is a really important part of that. And I guess for the other sort of bit of that, the debate of thinking about how you like push back against that, how you engage with it, is there are also sort of a group of people who I guess are sort of like, I call them in my head like anti-immigration professionals. Like, it's their sort of job to sort of argue against immigration on public platforms. And one of the things that they often sort of the logic that roots a lot of their thinking around migration is not only that there's a scarcity in relation to economics and thinking about, say, the NHS being overburdened. Part of what their argument is that there is a sort of British community or British culture that, in order to have people buy into a collective institution like the NHS and support that, you have to have a common culture. And if you have too many people coming in of this like different natures, like how they often describe it, or different cultures, really racialized argument, then that really undermines the bonds of solidarity that are necessary for the NHS. And as well as being rooted in really racist understanding of belonging and culture, and sort of what Britain is. The logic of that is rooted in an idea of inevitability, which is that if you have too many people of a certain kind coming into a country, it is inevitable that certain, and often it's not that explicitly articulated, but the figure is often of the white working class, which is obviously really problematic for a number of different reasons. The natural response will be to say you've got to reduce immigration. So there's this sort of perverse logic of victim blame, like almost victim blaming, of saying the reason there's racism is because there's too many migrants of color in Britain, and so to reduce racism, you reduce immigration, right? And so I guess you've got to go right for the heart of that, and argue against that very logic, which is bound up with these ideas of scarcity and sort of what people will accept. And there's way too much sort of fixation on reading the opinion polls and then sort of responding in the way that the opinion polls tell you to respond, as opposed to taking that public opinion, which is really obviously flawed in terms of like how that's even the questions that are asked, how that is used in political debate, reading that and using it as a way to think, okay, so what are the counter arguments that I need to make in relation to this? And so I think there's just way too little of that, at least in like parliamentary politics. But I think the two are sort of bound up together, of like the economic scarcity and then the sort of cultural anxiety argument.
Fantastic. So we're going to kind of drop in some questions from the chat in a second. So do start sending some more questions to us. I did want to skip a little bit towards thinking about prison abolition and its connection to border politics. So SDS has for a long time been working to integrate its kind of politics with an abolitionist frame that connects border enforcement with other punitive institutions, such as prisons, policing, mental health facilities, schooling, these kinds of things. So much of pro-migration campaigning trades on the idea of innocence. The idea of innocence is required for someone to be worthy of security, of safety, to be with one's family. And I wondered, how are abolitionist movements against prisons and policing linked to border abolition, maybe both in terms of kind of analysis, but also in terms of strategy as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think for one, it's linked because immigration detention is absolutely part of the kind of prison industrial complex. And when I talk about the prison industrial complex, I mean the web of institutions and laws and policies that include police, prisons, probation, surveillance, courts, tagging, detention and deportation, and more. And abolitionist work is about looking at all of these institutions and recognizing that they don't solve kind of social and economic issues. As Angela Davis says, prisons, for example, disappear human beings. They don't disappear social issues. I'm paraphrasing there. So I don't think that the prison industrial complex solves the root causes of social issues, which are largely about kind of inequality and the unfair distribution of resources, whether that's jobs or housing or healthcare or education. I think detention centres are related to this issue specifically because they serve a political and a monetary purpose, which kind of guides us a bit in our strategies, I think, in abolition. They are profit-making private companies. I think all but one detention centres in the UK are privately run, and they suit these government agendas where politicians can say they're being tough on immigration. With detention centres, it's even less evident that they're solving any social issues, primarily because migration isn't a social issue. It's the government response to migration and kind of legislating around immigration and creating immigration legislation at all that creates the issues in the context of centuries of racism and legislative hostility to people coming to this country. But also we know this because detention centres don't even meet their stated aim. In the past decade, the proportion of people who have been deported after being detained has nearly halved, and yet the kind of amount of people detained each year has kind of flatlined around 25 to 30,000 people. In terms of the role of the police in upholding the border, you know, the police are institutionally racist and classist. They aren't a neutral peacekeeping instrument. They exist very much to protect the interests of government and capital. An example of this is, you know, there are migrant survivors who are trying to flee domestic violence, where perpetrators are, and a trigger warning here for domestic violence and sexual assault, where perpetrators are threatening to cancel their visas if they report abuse to the police. And if people do report, the police are then sharing data with the Home Office. So, for example, we see cases like in 2017 where a pregnant woman reported rape at a police station and then was taken to a sexual assault centre, met with immigration enforcement, who took her into custody and interrogated her about her immigration status. So we can kind of see how the agents of the state, whether it's police or border enforcement, work in synchrony with each other to uphold the border. But to kind of touch on your other point about innocence and borders defining who can cross them and which families are allowed to stay together, I think the border is premised upon maintaining the kind of racial capitalist world order, which necessarily involves the oppression of queer communities. Also in that it upholds a certain type of family unit, which is very much based on gender binaries and misogyny and transphobia and a certain way of structuring society. And there's a really great book that I think you mentioned at the beginning called Deporting Black Britons by Luc de Noronha, which came out last year. And that book portrays 4 portraits of young Black British men who were deported to Jamaica. And he touches on the fact that these men had, I think the phrase used by the Home Office was kind of unconventional family settings or had multiple partners. And this was weaponized against them when they tried to make a case to remain in the country on the basis of family life. You know, the government deemed that the type of family they had wasn't something that fit into the rules and values of British life, whatever those are. And in this way, it's very kind of evident that borders uphold particular normative ideas of how society should look, which are loosely configured around families being these productive, heteronormative economic units. And we see very much the same thing happening when people are criminalized, that criminalization meaning that you can be locked up and prevented from seeing your family. I think all of these issues are very much kind of linked, and abolition across these contexts is about building these communities of care and compassion and saying, these institutions are doing harm. Why are they here? Are they a profit-making enterprise that's making kind of money off human misery? And so perhaps they have no place in our society, the one that we're trying to build together.
Yeah, I think that analysis is really incredible, and I think there are other aspects of kind of the strategies and ideas within prison abolition, which obviously has another long kind of different kind of history. But I think that maybe there are some underutilized ideas in the border abolition movement, maybe around like we're challenging the idea that these institutions keep us safe and thinking about what does safety mean and who and what kinds of things keep us safe. I think maybe thinking about the idea of non-reformist reforms and really understanding what abolitionist reforms can mean in the context of borders, I think is something which maybe is not something we kind of really understand in the border context. Transformative justice and how we respond to harm within our movements is obviously something that's kind of consistently relevant as well. And thinking about other kind of forms of harm protection, which I think all like different like things that I think there's a real like cross-fertility of knowledge and ideas that can come in on these. Okay, so we've got some other questions that we can return to, but I'm going to go to the chat and see what we have. So 1 second. Yeah, Matt says stats shows that the number of people in detention is downwards. How much of that is an effect of our kind of abolitionist action, and how much of is that a kind of an aspect of kind of government choice? And how do you see like that the detention system in the next 1 to 2 years or longer, five years? Do you see what's the trajectory, I guess, of border control in the near future? I guess that's the kind of argument. Question maybe more about the plans for asylum and detention. There, Maya, maybe you could comment on this.
I mean, I imagine Leah's better place to speak with more knowledge about this, but I suppose in terms of the like the future trajectory, I mean, what we do know, even looking at what's happened with the Napier barracks, what we do know is that the government just does intend, with this sort of 2-tier system, does intend to detain. I mean, it's hard to see how they wouldn't then detain more people because of this so-called illegal people being treated differently depending on if they've come in through legal resettlement routes or illegal routes. And it's all worth noting that whilst we don't want to like reify the legal, given all the problems with the way that our legal system functions, it's worth noting that the UN estimates that 0.1% of refugees globally come through resettlement routes. So we sort of know what this is gonna mean. But I would also sort of caution or worry or like suggest that there's reason to be worried about the broader immigration plans around their so-called points-based system, because it not only is it really classist system, is it looks like from some of the pilot schemes they're doing, they may allow people to come into the country through particular these short-term visas which already exist, but that will really create more people who are further exploitable, and I think it will leave more people with little choice other than to be undocumented in the UK, and what that will then mean for sort of deportation, detention, I think is worrying. But I mean, I think Leah could probably more accurately speak to that.
I mean, there's always loads to say. Immigration laws and policies are kind of constantly changing in this country. I handed in my first draft of the book as the pandemic hit, so a lot kind of changed even just during the editing process in terms of how issues that affect everyday people were kind of changing and being treated. In terms of the kind of trajectory of the border, I think with Priti Patel at the helm, it's going in a very particular and quite alarming direction, alongside the kind of 2-tier asylum process that Maya and I have both kind of spoken about. The government is proposing to reduce the ability for people to make further submissions and appeals later on in the asylum process, which of course kind of disregards common sense around how trauma and PTSD works, and the time and breathing space that people might need when they're beginning to speak about their experiences. So that just means less people are going to have access to kind of make asylum applications that they might want to. And we also know the government has pledged to deport people, as I say, who've kind of entered the UK through these informal routes, having traveled through a safe country in which they could allegedly have claimed asylum, other than just sounding illogical and obviously inhumane to many people listening, I'm sure. Even by the laws of the land, by the 1951 Refugee Convention, people seeking asylum are allowed to claim in their intended destination or another safe country. So this just kind of shows us the continued slipperiness, I think, of laws and how we can't rely on them as safeguards, because inequality is baked into their very existence, and the government can and will attempt to kind of move around them. I think another new piece of legislation, which hopefully will be kind of defied by all the brilliant organising happening around the police crime and sentencing and courts bill. In that bill, we're seeing other kind of ways of bordering and other ways that the border regime is being maintained, and how it's a kind of trailer to the upcoming sovereign borders bill, which I think could potentially bring in this much shorter 6-month threshold for somebody who's served a 6 months or who's been inside for 6 months in a prison, they would be automatically considered for deportation. At the moment, that threshold is 12 months. So we're seeing this kind of, creeping, ramping up of ways to apply border enforcement and border controls. And I think that is the trajectory that things are moving in. There was a first bit of the question, but I think maybe Maya answered it.
I think we covered it at least earlier, and
okay.
I think. I've got a question from Catherine. Do you have any ideas about how we can balance the firefighting reactive side of migrant solidarity work with building a broader anti-borders movement when often groups have limited capacity? I think it's a really great question. Does anyone want to come in on it? Leah?
What do you think, Tom? Let's disrupt the hierarchy of this conversation.
I think the firefighting side and the reactive side of working with people at the sharp end of these movements is is obviously the kind of the legal support and the practical support is a priority, but I think that it presents opportunities to work in solidarity and in alongside people in a detained context, and you see this through. I mean, I think SDS has done this kind of work. I was a part of a group called Detained Voices that often supported protests within detention, and I think it's when that kind of firefighting side of things can break out into wider conversations with the people you are talking with. Really trying to understand what we're up against, what the system is about, and bringing them and linking people into the broader movement who are like at the sharp edge of it. I've slightly avoided the idea of it being a kind of a resources matter, because I think that one has to concede that there are resources. But I think the other thing is that you can be doing firefighting stuff for a long time and it feels I think it can feel really like demoralizing and hard, and then there are always going to be opportunities that will present themselves through being at the front, through being at the sharp edge of things, because they're the people who know the system most and are most understanding of how to resist that system. And I think there are always going to be opportunities that can kind of present themselves through being in solidarity, and that must mean solidarity. It can't mean that we're bringing the ideas to them. Like, it's about a conversation, and I think that's what I would say about how to combine those two things.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think just to kind of tack on, I think you were talking about firefighting and the kind of demoralization, Tom. I think it's really useful to have an awareness of the kind of cycle of social movements. So the way in which social movements fluctuate and appear to kind of grow and then disappear off the radar. Obviously, a recent example is the protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd by police. That was a trigger event that, because of a combination of factors, including the way that the pandemic has been compounding inequality, saw this kind of massive public outcry and protest, which was followed, by months later by a contraction of interest in that issue, and then maybe a period of reflection, maybe growth for some people, and a return to normal. But normal is now a slightly different place than when we started. It's still not up there at the peak of the protests in June by any means, but social attitudes for some people, and to an extent, have dialed up a small notch. And I think when we're feeling really demoralized about having, doing this kind of firefighting work for many years, I think it can be useful to kind of come back to that and look at examples through history about how movements oscillate and kind of bring us forward in ways that are maybe quite incremental when we're working in this very micro-focused way. Yeah.
That's so useful to have this longer term vision, and the life cycle of movements. I think is such an important thing to realize about whether at the peak of it, whether we're taking some rest, whether we're building up for the next stage. I think these are things that are really important. Maybe I'll move to the next question. So SD support was born out of a university space, and its solidarity is often relied on the time that students have to use to take a trip to detention, which takes time, and also potentially the fact that they're studying the creation of borders at university, or colonialism or racism. Leah, I know you chat about the variety of ways and tactics you've seen in your book, but how do we make border abolition solidarity more accessible and visible to encourage people into the movement, and also use so academic language doesn't exclude people? So I guess the possibilities of university spaces, but also the problems that organising within university spaces presents.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have an easy answer to that. I think I echo the question almost. Like I very much have that question myself. And when I was writing the book, it was important to me that it was a kind of, I know it's quite dense with like sources and stats, but I want it to be like a relatively digestible piece of information. Like it's not a massive weighty tome, it's not written in academic language. Hopefully people have found it readable. I'm very open to feedback on that. So I suppose I don't really have an answer, but more I echo the question. I think it's very important that we make sure that our social movements are accessible and have a range of different entry points, because that's how we grow them, through the process of kind of seeing what works, recognizing wins, learning from those wins, sharing that information, and then making it very clear that people can be involved in that work. And you can see examples of that, like with the anti-raids work, particularly around the kind of anti-raids network, when people saw raids happening in their communities, and it was very clear that some actions that you could take were, dragging some dumpsters so the van couldn't drive away, or there were very clear actions that people could take. I think that then spread as a form of resistance, in a way that other forms of resistance haven't. So I think making resistance, or making ways to resist clear and understandable and accessible are incredibly important. That's how we're going to keep kind of chipping away at the border, I think.
Yeah, just to like really quickly come in and agree with that. I think that it's about sometimes bringing people with you as well, and that doesn't mean like having to dilute what the demands are, or how we're understanding what bordering is doing. But I do think it is sometimes also a degree of patience of like when you're bringing people with you, what that means, what that sort of journey is. And I think like books like Leah's are a really good tool for that as well, because I mean I've read it, I can say that it's really readable, like it's written in also like really, like parts of it are really poetic in terms of how that the resistance is being described, how the sort of terrain of what that resistance looks like. And so I think inspiring people that change is possible as well. And even I was thinking when you were both talking about like when you were both just talking in relation to the last question, is that one of the things that makes me feel hopeful is, as well as all the people who are doing like so much of this really important good work, is that the people who are just coming up, like I mean now I'm just old, so like the young people who are like so much more savvy than I was when I was like 16 or 17, probably savvier than I am now, who are being brought into politics through one route or another, whether that is thinking about climate, whether that is thinking about their experiences of the pandemic and the awful way that certain young people have been treated, whether it is like the job market or whether it is looking at universities. And so there is connections to be made there. I think there are people who are sort of there ready already unhappy with what the status quo is, and then sort of bringing those connections in of saying, like, understanding the climate crisis is related to capitalism, but it's also related to bordering, like making those connections with people is, I think, just to really like not getting caught up in the academic language is, I think, really important. It's so alienating, and it can't be overstated enough that you don't have to lose the critical analysis, you don't have to lose the clarity of thought by just like talking in a way that like we all sort of get. It just makes it, like, basically just reiterating what Leah said, is it does make it sort of easier for people to engage in that. That can only be a good thing, I think.
Great. So I have a kind of technical question about the new asylum policy and how it relates to education. So right now, children and families, it's from a teacher. So right now, children and families who have no recourse to public funds can attend school, in Scotland anyway, and can get free school meals and a clothing grant. Asylum is a reserved power, but I wonder where the new asylum policy leaves families I work with. Will they be still able to attend school, for example? Is that something either of you would be able to comment on?
I can't comment on that specifically. Did the person asking the question say they were based in Scotland? Did I just imagine that? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's kind of similar policies in England. I work with families based in England, in that certain groups of people with NRPF can get free school meals for certain periods of time. It's very kind of restricted and very limited. I haven't heard anything about people, like children of people who are seeking asylum, not being able to go to school. I think if that was a thing that was upcoming, I would hope that we would know about it now and kind of be trying to push back against it. I mean, never say never with someone like Priti Patel at the helm. You can never know where it's going to go, but I haven't heard anything about that meaning any impacts on children's ability to go to school. I think what it could mean is the kind of this kind of slow but sure stripping away of the things that children need to be at school. Like if you can't get a free school meal, you know, and you can't focus in your lessons, then yeah, it's a question of whether can that child actually access school if they can't kind of access it on the same level as everybody else. So yeah, it's definitely something to keep an eye on, but I haven't heard anything specifically around access to kind of school as a baseline.
Great. So I got another question, well, a question from Katie about, I think, kind of imagining a post-border world. Or, I think that's kind of the idea. Is like, so I think it was touched on how borders manifest inside nation states and how they demarcate access to public funds and services within nation states. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on how to ensure these policies are not remodeled if the border was abolished. So how to ensure that dismantling of a border was not symbolic and that these forms of violence did not persist under other auspices. So yeah, how can we ensure that the abolishing of a border is permanent?
I feel like this could be like a whole series of talks. It's a really great question. I mean, I think for me personally, abolishing the border is very much tied up in kind of abolishing the state and a complete kind of reconfiguration of how society is ordered. You know, whether that would come with a universal basic income or kind of other ways of sharing resources, it absolutely wouldn't be, you know, parallel structures. That we wouldn't be universal credit but no border. Like that's not going to cut the mustard. So yeah, that's my short answer. I think it would very much involve like a dramatic, a doable but very kind of across the piece reconfiguring of society that wouldn't be about working within the kind of artificial constraints that we are given at the moment.
And I think the imagination of the revolution or the abolishing of the border is not going to be an event, is it? It's going to be a continual process of examining and opening and understanding how we can resist these things, and that requires the continuation of strong social movements and strong radical social movements, right? And Maya, did you have anything to think about?
Well, no, I mean, I just think that when, like, as has already sort of been implied or suggested, is that when we're thinking about the border, we're not just thinking about the border, we're not just thinking about movement, we're thinking about all of the norms and sort of ways of understanding the world that come with that. And so earlier when I said that it's not only about having the right to move, it's about having the right to stay as well. We are talking about global capitalism. We are thinking about how our global economy functions and how that produces so many of the inequalities that do mean that people have to move. And so I guess like the sort of, I often think it's like when you're talking about border abolition, you're thinking about almost everything, right? You're thinking about the world as we understand it at the moment. And for me, a sort of good way of beginning to like think about steps, there's a recent book by an academic called P.O. Hansen that is about, it's called something like Rethinking Modern Migration Theory. And he interestingly sort of critiques the narrative that we've, heard for so long now, that a country's budget is like a household budget, and that you have to, it's basically the austerity narrative. And what he uses is modern monetary theory as a way in to actually say that this isn't how debt works, this isn't how state finances work. And so the moment that you begin to understand that is the moment that you actually realize those discussions we were having earlier about scarcity don't actually make any sense. They don't make any economic sense. And so for me, that's sort of like a step. Like that's not the entirety of everything that needs to change, but it's a step of like unsettling these narratives that sort of underpin so much of the way that movement is problematized, and the way that the people who are moving is problematized, and the way that the border showed up. And so I guess that's something that I feel like the left in Britain more broadly isn't grasping with. Like there'll be debates about economic inequality, and like immigration is just like sidelined in that, or like even understanding the problems of international development, it's like sidelined. And actually these things are all connected. And so to have the kind of abolition that Leah's talking about is to speak to all of that. And it's just not, when you sideline things like race and immigration, you're not going to get there. And so it is about centering those in those discussions, I think.
Yeah, and I completely agree that the book does such a great job of connecting a whole array of issues that need to be addressed together. And I want to kind of connect that question with something I wanted to ask before, was that in the book you write about the state, and you say the state will never meaningfully legislate for open, relaxed or no borders, because to do so would blur the edges of its own power. And I wondered what your thinking was around the role of the state, and how we might think about border abolition being achieved through a movement that isn't consistently addressing the state. I wondered, could you let us know your thoughts on that, Leah?
Yeah, I mean, I think I find a lot of energy and motivation in knowing that changes are kind of steps along the process of abolition have largely come about through grassroots movements and public pressure and scrutiny, organizing from the bottom up. And while we're kind of fighting against these huge structures of oppression, there are actually limits to the border regime. There are limits to the money that can be poured in. There are limits to operational power. There are legal limits of how brutal the border is likely to be in public. In theory, of course, there are examples of people being killed in broad daylight, like Jimmy Mabenga, who was killed by G4S security guards on a BA flight. And there are also kind of cultural limits around what people are willing to let happen. And I think the Windrush scandal was an example of a certain, this isn't a kind of perfect term, but a certain kind of cultural limit that was broached, and media outlets and politicians across the kind of political spectrum decided, or said that they decided, that it wasn't acceptable for this specific group of people in this specific moment. So there are kind of roots of resistance, there are moments of resistance, and individual acts of resistance that join together. And I think rather than or as well as a kind of addressing the state, we can expand the sites for resistance and push up against those limits that I've just listed, to kind of keep opening the door so that we don't just end up with specific siloed groups of people who are allowed in the UK and offered sympathy and other people being shut out. And I think in terms of thinking about this as kind of long haul, slow long-term work, it's absolutely not about thinking that if we address demands to politicians, they will eventually abolish the border. It's about engaging in this multiplicity of tactics, whether it's no borders camps in Calais and border crossings and anti-deportation campaigns aimed at the public or at airline carriers. There are actually a wide range of stakeholders in the border. And actually the state is just one of them, albeit a very sizable one, but there are lots of different kind of routes that we can be taking at the same time. And the evidence that we have before us in terms of the kind of archival history of our movement is that those moments of change have come from our grassroots movements, not from politicians kind of waking up and deciding to like make nice policies or change bad ones.
Maya, did you want to come in on this?
No, I mean, I just agree with that. And I think that like, even when there has been like positive political change, however limited that is, like what's often erased from that, like, I don't know, the Labour Party, an anti-racist party, whatever, like the evidence that's used to like sort of prove that is often pieces of policy or for campaigns that are built from exactly the movements that Leah's talking about. And yeah, sometimes there's some recognition of that, but I don't feel like there's a sufficient recognition of actually the roots of that change and what that looked like. And so there's a thinking about that is like, it's true, the Labour Party is a party that has introduced race relations legislation, albeit almost always at the same time it was introducing really racialized immigration legislation, so like make of that what you will. But that, even the movements for that kind of change, that wasn't born just out of, as Leah says, politicians deciding that they wanted to do something that would make Britain slightly less discriminatory. Actually, this was born out of exactly the movements that she's talking about. And so I think that, yeah, I just agree that that's how we can imagine and understand these historical processes and how where it's worth investing time now, I suppose.
Yeah, I agree. I think a really good example of that is around deportations, obviously a kind of thing that SDS works a lot on, as well as other groups, and the kind of strategies and tactics that seem to be effective aren't really asking the government to like stop doing it. It's things like, the Stansted 15 action, which stopped a deportation flight was it in 2017, I think, and things like kind of making the flights untenable or kind of making airline carriers worried about their commercial reputation. These are all tactics and strategies that aren't about addressing the state. They're kind of taking lots of other, in various ways, kind of very successful routes. I know that LGSM was successful in getting Virgin Atlantic to say that they were going to stop doing deportations. Whether they've followed through on it is another matter, but I think that's a kind of, it sets a precedent, that other airlines can be held to in terms of, saying that you should be doing the same thing. So I think, yeah, absolutely, as Maya says, these strategies and tactics are not just about looking at the state. They're coming up from grassroots movements and taking lots of different angles.
Great. I think I've got two more questions left, I think, and then we'll end the event. So the first one is from Ewan, and they ask, love to hear if any of the speakers would be able to share any thoughts on connecting border abolition movements to labour movements, working both and maybe working labour movements that work across borders as well as within particular borders as well. I think that's a really vital and important question. Does anyone want to come in first on it? Go on, Leah.
again, I feel like with 6 minutes left, there's so much that could be said about this. I think it's very important. I think you can think about the way that labor is kind of exploited and produced like within the apparatus of the border regime. So people working for £1 an hour in detention centres, at the very same jobs that they were criminalised and incarcerated for doing outside of detention, now doing it at a kind of tiny fraction of what minimum wage is. I think there is some work being done in unions. I read a briefing actually the other day. I don't know if it was Unite or TUC, but it was around kind of solidarity within workplaces, and if there's a raid, or if employers are asking to see ID and to see papers, how workers can kind of come together and all refuse uniformly to do that in order to kind of be in solidarity with people who don't have papers. I think in terms of working across borders, I mean, I feel like there's an opportunity, I think, for unions to be working in kind of cross-border ways, so that particularly around, what the government has framed modern slavery, but the kind of broad issue of labour exploitation, which the government doesn't actually want to tackle. If there were union kind of memberships that could travel across borders with people as they move, would that be helpful when people are in a new country, perhaps undocumented and incredibly vulnerable, therefore, to exploitation, with nowhere to kind of turn and no recourse if they do face exploitation? If that union membership could move across with them, would there be a potential there for that person to have some support if they weren't getting their wages? Would there be someone who could advocate for them without having to turn to the police or somebody who's going to turn them into the Home Office? So I think it's a really important site of opportunity, which I'd love to know if that's being explored more.
Maya, do you have anything to add reasonably shortly? Because I would really like to get to the last question as well.
Just really quickly, I mean, we know that like governments don't just want to stop people from coming to countries like the UK, they also want to decide the terms on which people enter and which they stay. And so the exploitation is embedded in the border regime. It's no surprise that the government is sort of like, they say they don't want people who are low skilled, i.e. people who are low paid, to be able to come to the UK, but they will. That's not actually what is going to happen. People are just going to come on rubbish terms. And so like it's a question of class solidarity. And I would say, although actually the union movement history is not great in the UK, there are actually, given that the borders are internal within the UK, maybe this is a bit of a stretch what I'm about to say, but you do see movements of, there's a really good example of on a council estate in Glasgow in like 2008, where there were some people who were seeking asylum were dispersed there by the new Labour government. And when they attempted to deport these people, all of the people on the estate resisted through, like, when there were dawn raids, they resisted, they refused to allow these people to be deported. That is a form of like solidarity across the borders that we're told are actually inherent or inevitable when people are going to be dispersed to these areas that are often really poor. And so we already see this happening, right, in loads of ways, that I think is really, really important. And I would just say the trade union movement in the UK probably just needs to get better. There's a good book called Imperialism, which touches on this. When the Rana Plaza disaster happened in Bangladesh, one of the responses from parts of the union movement in the UK was to talk about sanctions against the Bangladeshi government that was going to do nothing for the workers within Bangladesh. And so actually making the connections that we've been talking about, that Leah's book comes back to and focuses on, I think is really important. That is, you can't have a decent class politics that doesn't center migrant rights and that doesn't center the kinds of resistance that we've been talking about.
Great. So the last question is going to be a combination of one that I had and also a one that's coming on the chat. So like border abolition is a long-term project, and working on the front line around immigration detention and deportation is quite unforgiving. Like daily violence experience to those who are close to us, repeated losses, a government that is intent on making the situation worse with every policy announcement. How can we individually and collectively build movements for the long haul. And I think someone from the chat has asked that there have been periods within SDS, for example, as one group, where kind of knowledge of how things work has left a group due to individuals being kind of burnt out around periods of particular activity, around the Hunger for Freedom process, for example. So I guess like both as a group thing, but also as a movement, how can we build for abolition in the long term?
I'll answer really quickly. I think the second question is a difficult one. Like my inclination is to do the standard answer of like collective care and like we need to put all these strategies in place. I know that SDS has tried lots of different strategies over the years and some have been useful and some haven't. So maybe it's a bit of a cop-out, but like I would be up for having a further discussion around like what the solution to kind of would come about burnout, you know, which is such a huge thing across, you know, different organizing groups. To kind of answer the first question quickly though, I think there's something that Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a prison abolition activist, talks about how we need to fight to win and to kind of be prepared for victories, and about how preparing to win means being ready for the morning after. And I think this is exactly what we were talking about a bit earlier. You know, if hundreds of people are released from detention, what happens next? Like, what does that mean? Are we ready for what happens then as movements? If we're so kind of unused to getting these small wins, actually we need to be fighting to win, fighting with the expectation that we will kind of get shifts in things and then preparing for the next step. So that's a very quick and probably quite unsatisfactory answer to both of those really important questions. But yeah, I'll hand over to you, Maya.
No, I mean, I don't think, I think that's, I don't have anything to add, I don't think.
Great. I think we should end there. Just before I say thank you to both Maya and Leah, I just wanted to point out that tomorrow there's a day of action by Abolish Detention Hassock Field. So that's the new detention centre that's being built, I think, near Durham. And they are having a kind of social media and telephone kind of action against a company called Galliford Try, which are involved in converting what was a prison into the detention centre for women. Obviously, this comes on the back of a kind of a seemingly positive development that Yarl's Wood was going to be closed. So there's important social movement organising going on in the Northeast around this. And I've put in the chat a link to their campaign. And so it'd be really great if like, everyone here could participate in that and support it. Oh yeah, I think we should end there. Thanks so much.
Can I just give a tiny, just some gratitude and thanks for your book, Maya, for the hostile environment. I think, you know, when I was writing my book, I didn't have to write loads and loads of chapters on the hostile environment because you have already created this kind of brilliant, like, forensic analysis of what that is and how it came about. So yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, if people haven't read it, you should definitely check it out.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, thanks so much, Maya, for your contributions today. It's been really interesting talking to you. Thank you, Leah, for your amazing book. It's such a privilege and honor. I feel a lot of pride being a part of this event, and yeah, loads of love. And thanks very much, everyone, for coming. And yeah, keep buy Leah's book. Keep a lookout for SDS events in the future. And yeah, thank you very much, everyone. I don't know how.